What's going on, everybody? Khalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Google Pixel 6a and the OnePlus Nord N20 5G. Now, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability. But with that being said, let's get started. So with the Google Pixel 6a, we're getting a 6.1-inch OLED display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 429, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 83% screen to body ratio. With the OnePlus Nord N20 5G, we're getting a 6.43-inch AMOLED display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 409, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and a screen to body ratio of about 85.3%. So these displays are really similar, and I feel like there's not a huge difference between them. But that being said, one advantage the OnePlus Nord N20 5G has is it is a little bit larger, as you can see here. So if you're consuming a lot of content, things are going to be easier to see, and you're probably going to get a slightly better experience overall. Both phones do have 1080p resolutions, which is going to give them a nice, sharp, crisp image. They have the same taller and more narrow form factors, so if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, with either of these phones, you're going to get a more immersive experience, and you're also going to get a pretty good scrolling experience as well. So in general, despite the slight advantage of the OnePlus Nord N20 5G being slightly larger, I would say these displays are pretty close. Now for storage, both of these phones are getting 128 gigabytes of internal storage, but one major difference here is that with the Google Pixel 6a, we're not getting microSD card expansion here, and on the other hand, the OnePlus Nord N20 5G does have microSD card expansion. Now, if this were a lower amount of storage, this would make a much bigger difference, but honestly, in my opinion, with 128 gigabytes of internal storage, most people are probably not going to need more than this. But if you do think you will, maybe you have a lot of photos and videos, for example, then the OnePlus Nord N20 5G that does have microSD card expansion will have an advantage here. But again, otherwise, with 128 gigabytes of internal storage, I feel like sometimes a lot of people don't realize how much storage that really is. Now, obviously, if you have 100 gigabytes of apps or something like that, it will fill up pretty quickly. But again, for most people, you're probably not going to fill it up. I personally have 128 gigabytes of internal storage on my iPhone 13, which of course does not have microSD card expansion, and I for one haven't had any problems. Now, of course, some of you might have more stuff on your phone than me, but again, in general, if you're just an average user, then even though the Google Pixel 6a doesn't have microSD card expansion, it still should be fine for you. Now for security features, both of these phones do have in-display fingerprint scanners, but with the Google Pixel 6a, unfortunately there's no face unlock, whereas the OnePlus Nord N20 5G has both a fingerprint scanner and face unlock. So if you do want both options, then definitely keep this in mind, but otherwise, if you're fine with just a fingerprint scanner, then it's probably not going to matter. But that being said, starting with the Google Pixel 6a, let's give these fingerprint scanners a try and see how well they work. So there we go, one more time. And there we go, real fast and responsive. Moving on to the OnePlus Nord N20 5G. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners worked really well, and obviously they are in the same spot, so there's really not a whole lot of a difference here. When it comes to security features, really the only thing that really matters between the two is whether or not you want face unlock. Because if you do, then of course the OnePlus Nord N20 5G will have an advantage, but again, if you don't care, then either of these phones will be perfectly fine. Now taking a look at the camera setups here, for the selfie camera with the Google Pixel 6a, we got a nice looking hole punch design, and this camera is 8 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a dual camera setup with a 12.2 megapixel main camera and a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera. Now with the OnePlus Nord N20 5G for the selfie camera, we got another hole punch design, this one being off to the side instead of centered, and this camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 64 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. Now there are a couple things I want to point out here. First of all, with the selfie cameras and the main cameras, although the OnePlus Nord N20 5G does have higher megapixels, this doesn't necessarily mean it's a better camera, because with the Google Pixel 6a, even though this isn't quite on the level of something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra, for example, it still is more of an entry-level flagship phone, which is still significantly higher end than something like the OnePlus Nord N20 5G. And as a result, even though the megapixels aren't as high, these cameras do have much stronger sensors, and as a result, in general, the Google Pixel 6a will take significantly better photos. And adding on to this point, even though the Google Pixel 6a doesn't have a depth sensing camera or a macro camera, it still does take really good portrait photos, as well as some nice close-up detailed images. So overall, the only real difference between these two as far as features go is that with the Google Pixel 6a, we are getting an ultra-wide camera, whereas the OnePlus Nord N20 doesn't have an ultra-wide camera, but it does have a dedicated macro camera. Now again, the Google Pixel 6a can get really good close-up detailed images, but at the same time, it still doesn't exactly have a dedicated macro camera. You basically just have to get the camera close to the subject or zoom in or something like that. Whereas again, with the OnePlus Nord N20, if you want to get macro type images, you can simply use the macro camera. Now all this being said, if you want to see actual photo and video samples from these phones, I have made dedicated camera reviews for each of them, which I will be linking in the description. But in general, I would say in terms of photo quality as well as features, the Google Pixel 6a is definitely the way to go here. As far as the camera goes, this phone is much better in pretty much every way. So whether you're a content creator or you just like taking photos, if that is a primary concern for you, this phone will be the better choice. But that being said, if you just want to take a nice picture every now and then, the OnePlus Nord N20 will still work fine. Now this also carries into the video quality. With the Google Pixel 6a, you can record in up to 4K at 60 frames per second in the rear camera and 1080p at 60 frames per second in the front, whereas with the OnePlus Nord N20, you can only record at 1080p in both the rear and front. So just like with the photos, if you're recording a lot of videos, then the Google Pixel 6a will have an advantage. Now as far as RAM and processor go, with the Google Pixel 6a, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the Google Tensor processor. With the OnePlus Nord N20, we're getting 6GB of RAM as well with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 695 5G processor. Now I ran Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and with the Google Pixel 6a, we're getting a single core score of 1055 and a multi-core score of 2956. With the OnePlus Nord N20, we're getting a single core score of 683 and a multi-core score of 1972. So as you can see here, just from this test alone, the Google Pixel 6a is much more powerful. So if you're doing more high performance activities like mobile gaming, for example, or if you're just on your phone a lot, then the Google Pixel 6a will have a huge advantage here. And it's at this point where you're going to start to see a huge difference in performance between this type of phone and a more mid-range phone like the OnePlus Nord N20. But that being said, if you're just doing more basic activities like web browsing, social media, stuff like that, then the OnePlus Nord N20 will be perfectly fine. And this is really not a slow phone by any means. In fact, if you've seen any of my other videos about this phone on the channel, you'll probably know it's actually the complete opposite. For what it is, the OnePlus Nord N20 does really have great performance, and for most activities, it's going to be perfectly fine. But that being said, what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, because that's really the only way you're going to see which one is going to be an upgrade for you. Although the Google Pixel 6a is obviously the faster of the two, you might find that for your needs compared to your current device, the OnePlus Nord N20 might be plenty of an upgrade already. Now for the battery, with the Google Pixel 6a, we're getting a 4410 mAh battery that supports 18 watt fast charging, and with the OnePlus Nord N20, we're getting a 4500 mAh battery that supports 33 watt fast charging. So as far as the actual battery size goes, these phones are pretty much the same. I mean, 90 mAh is really not going to make a difference. So as far as battery life and longevity goes, I wouldn't really say there's that much of a difference between these two, but fast charging is a different story. With the OnePlus Nord N20, 33 watt fast charging is definitely significant. So if that is an important feature for you, maybe you often find yourself in situations where you can't always charge up your phone for a long time, then the extra fast charging you get with the OnePlus Nord N20 will make a difference. But otherwise, if you don't care about fast charging, maybe you leave your phone plugged in all day anyway, then either of these phones will be perfectly fine battery wise. Now for the software, the Google Pixel 6a, being a Google phone, will have a huge advantage here. This phone does have Android 12, and obviously since again it is a Google phone, it is going to get plenty of major updates, whereas with the OnePlus Nord N20, for whatever reason, this phone only has Android 11, and although I at least assume it will eventually get Android 12, it still is behind, especially since Android 13 is really just right around the corner. So of course, if getting the latest version of Android is important to you, then the Google Pixel 6a will have a huge advantage here. And in addition to this, both phones do have NFC, so if you like to make mobile contactless payments using tap and pay, you can do that with either device. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, I would say for the most part, the Google Pixel 6a has most of the advantages here. It has a much more powerful processor, a newer version of Android, as well as better software support in general, and a much better camera setup that can also record videos in 4K. But on the other hand, the OnePlus Nord N20 does have a larger display, an ever so slightly larger battery with better fast charging, and it does have microSD card expansion as well. In addition to this, the price range is also another thing to consider here. This phone is significantly more affordable than the Google Pixel 6a, and even though the Google Pixel 6a does have most of the advantages, like for example the processor The OnePlus Nord N25G, while not being as fast, still does have great performance, and for most people it's probably going to be plenty fast enough. While the Google Pixel 6a does technically have a better camera setup and records better videos, the OnePlus Nord N25G is still perfectly fine for casual use. So at the end of the day, yeah, the Google Pixel 6a is definitely the better device here, but the OnePlus Nord N25G not only does have a couple of its own advantages, but overall, if you're just looking for a solid phone that works really well and you just don't need anything fancy, then the OnePlus Nord N25G is definitely a great option. Now, once again, if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as information on pricing and availability, because this is always changing. But this concludes my comparison between the Google Pixel 6a and the OnePlus Nord N25G. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found it useful as well. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next one.